with thunderstorms on every side, but we survived it. But I don't know if he was going to admit to it, but he got to fly the plane, first time in his life, so it was fun. No, he's from, not Acapella, Pocatello, Idaho. I thought that was a suburb of Boise, but it turns out it's what, 200 miles away? Something like that. About a population of 50,000, so this is small town for him. But of course he's written a book, he's got a guide. His resume is about so thick. I think you'll be real pleased with Dr. Yes, Jeff.
Slide this back just a little bit here, not shine that light inside. Well, thanks so much, Bill, for that introduction and for the opportunity to the entire committee and the great hospitality and all the interesting activities the event has offered so far. This presentation is going to be a little more of a general overview and a summary of some of the things that motivate me to keep looking at this subject, and that have led me to our most recent initiative known as the Falcon Project. I'll be describing that, introducing that as well. All right, this is not my last one. There we go. Okay, just got to find where I'm at here. You know, I was curious with the proliferation, obviously, in the digital age of online information. I don't think any youngster even knows what a Webster's dictionary is anymore. You go online and just Google the definition of a word, or the computer prompts you with a definition. So I was curious to see how the subject of Bigfoot was being treated here in this time, at this time. So I looked at quite a number of online dictionaries for a definition of Sasquatch, and this was a common one that was quite representative of the types of definitions that are out there. I was actually quite pleased with the definition. A large, hairy, humanoid creature said to live in wilderness areas of the United States and Canada. Synonym Bigfoot. This one came from the Free Dictionary. Now I added the italics there to emphasize that because I was somewhat pleased that there was no mention of folklore or legend or myth, but rather it was just acknowledged that the evidence is anecdotal. It's said to exist in these areas, but otherwise the description was quite reasonable. Of course, we know that the roots of this phenomenon, this creature, go way, way back to the earliest indigenous inhabitants of this continent. I was always impressed with this. I actually had one of those Time, Life, Nature series on the emergence of man, and thumbing through that book that series, there was a picture that jumped out at me, and this was the depiction of a potlatch ceremony of the Coatl tribe, a group within the Coatl tribe, up on the Pacific Northwest coast, and they're all decked out in their ceremonial regalia. There are all sorts of interesting figures. Some are more abstract. I mean, like there's this the shaman figure back here, the antlered man, and sometimes the abstract depictions are hard for us to interpret. But boy, leaping right out of the picture right there, there's the Bukwas, the wild man of the woods. And it has that very characteristic, almost stereotypical depiction of this character with the heavy brow, the deep-set eyes, the wide flaring nostrils, the muscular lips pulled back to reveal these very squared-off teeth, no projecting canine teeth, and of course the wild shock of hair coming down and covering it. Now, the female counterpart of the wild people of the woods is the Zonaquat. She's also referred to sometimes as the cannibal woman or the cannibal giant. And one of her characteristics is that pursed lip posture to signify her wailing call and her habit of whistling. And I find this very interesting because even down in the Rocky Mountains, some of my students have been tribal members from the Shoshone tribe, and tell me that growing up, their elders, their grandparents would tell them, when you're coming home late at night, you never whistle in the dark, especially if you're alone, because you'll attract the cannibal woman. So even down here, now notice she also has these big, oversized hands. Traditionally, she would apply pine pitch to those hands, kind of like NFL receivers to help them catch the football. And that would help her when she would use those hands to scoop up wayward children who are out and about when they shouldn't be, and pitch them into a rather primitive wicker basket which she carried on her back, and take them home for dinner. Not as dinner guests, but as the main course. Of course, she's very dull-witted. She's very, a bit feeble-minded, and the basket's very crude. Sometimes she would even fall asleep at her post, and so the kids could usually pick their way out of the bottom of the basket and make their escape. So it wasn't always so nefarious a story. But it's interesting, when I was in Wyoming working with John Meinzinski, we were up following up on at a location where there had been a number of incidences. And one of these actually involved the possible shooting of Sasquatch. A gentleman was living in this valley and had a large garden, and he depended on that garden, and so he guarded it pretty vigorously. One night there was something in his garden. He came out loaded with a loaded shotgun, and thinking that some deer or something had gotten into the garden, or some varmint. Up stands the Sasquatch, and he claims he emptied both barrels into its chest at close range with enough force that it knocked it back through the picket fence, but it jumped right back up and took off. He probably didn't have it loaded with really heavy shot. But there was blood evidence. The next day the deputy sheriff was there. He collected up the bits of the fence, the broken fence that had the blood on it. John went to investigate within a day later and tried to track down the deputy sheriff. But the deputy, not wanting to be bothered with this ridiculous story of a hairy wild man, had simply thrown the picket fence into the incinerator. But we were up on the hillside, and the hillside was covered with pictographs, with these painted pictures. And there were all types of scenes that you might imagine, depictions of village life, depictions of cavalrymen on horseback. And usually the figures of the people were rather primitive. They were very simple stick figures, just lines indicating their bodies. But this one was different. Unfortunately, there's a lot of water damage. But you can see that obviously the body was very thick. You know, there's a shoulder, you can't see the head, but this big arm with this big hand, and then sticking off to the side this enormous foot. And I was struck by the similarity here. Then in another part of Wyoming, there's a whole collection of petroglyphs where they're actually pecked into the stone. We were actually visiting and traveling with a former state archaeologist from the state of Wyoming, in Wyoming. He had come upon a very large panel that hadn't been cataloged to his knowledge. And so he was having trouble interpreting some of these figures. So he invited a couple of the elders to come out with him and tell him what they thought of this. Well, they were having a good time. He brought some refreshments to sweeten the deal a little bit, and they were laughing and joking and walking up, and as they rounded the corner and came face to face with this large panel, in center stage, this big figure, they suddenly became very quiet. And they started talking to each other in Shoshone, and then they backed up very quickly, and they grabbed him and they said, "You're not supposed to be here. We're not supposed to be here. This is a sacred site." They pulled him back. Well, they finally confided in him that this was this depictions of and their various names, the lost brother, or the Soavits, we'll see in a minute, or of course, the Tsonakwa is a term restricted to the Kuau tribe. But again, I was struck, and one of the characteristics that he said often depicted this was these chevrons on the chest. And there's a slight hint, you can almost see the pursed lips there, but then the upraised hands again, once again. Now, I was thumbing through a catalog of petroglyphs from southern Utah that are attributed to the Anasazi, this ancient tribe that completely disappeared, we know very, very little about. Now, someone questioned my comparison. He offered a different explanation for this, and I need to look into it further. But again, I was impressed by this common theme of these upraised hands. I can appreciate that when you imagine a figure that otherwise looks like a big bear, hair-covered upright figure, but yet doesn't have a paw with claws, but has human-like fingers, a hand, a five-fingered hand. That might be a characteristic that would stand out in your mind that you would want to really emphasize in your depiction. So, is this just coincidence that all across the western United States there are these similar depictions? Now, are these just so stories? As was mentioned earlier, is this just a boogeyman tale to keep wayward children in line? Well, we now know that there are higher primates, like the chimpanzees especially, that are rather predatory at times, and very frequently prey on smaller primates. And so these perhaps rare events when humans are abducted for whatever reason, maybe those have some grain of truth. In Uganda just a few years ago, that it finally made the news. I had heard some stories through back channels, through acquaintances that had been involved in some of these incidents. Excuse me. During the very difficult drought conditions, the chimpanzees in that region had abducted children on several occasions. In a 7-month period, there were 12 instances of children taken by chimpanzees. I'll just add this into a more contemporary depiction. The Washington State Historical Society, in their museum in Tacoma, put on a very nice exhibit, and Giants in the Mountains it was called, and they commissioned a native artist, a contemporary native artist, to depict the Tzonakwa. And she used a little bit of license here in her interpretation, attributing some of the hairiness of the Tzonakwa to a bear skin draped over her shoulders. But you look at her arms and legs, she could probably pass as a hobbit pretty easily with those hairy feet. And here are the hapless children that have been pitched into the basket, and this one kind of is lurking back behind watching, and she's got her mouth in the characteristic pursing posture, whistling to draw their attention. Another friend of mine is a native artist on the Shoban, in the Shoban tribe. He's Bannock, on the Fort Hall Reservation just north of Pocatello. He grew up in northern Nevada, and there he heard stories, again, of snatching of children. There was a particular instance that everyone was aware of where during a particularly hard winter, in the depths of the winter, big hairy arm comes under the teepee border and snatches a crying child, and on it goes. So he's worked this into some of his art depictions. You can see the line of footprints and the shadowy figure here in the tree line, just biding his time for an opportunity. In fact, if you go to northern Nevada, there's a region called the Jarbidge Mountains, and there's beautiful mountains down there out in that otherwise sagebrush steppe desert. And the locals there use the resources of the mountains to hunt, to fish, to collect goods. But they don't live up there. They live down in the sagebrush. And when the early Western settlers, the European settlers came into the area, they queried, why is it that you don't spend more time up there? And they said, because it's where the Saabits lives. Now, Saabits is the Shoshone word for the eater of children. And Jarbidge is actually a degradation of Saabits. And so that's the root of there's a widely known and widely publicized legend of the Jawbridge the Jawbridge monster. There's also, along with the mountain range, there's a very deep canyon where the water has cut a course down through there. And this monster is said to reside down in that canyon. Some of the native depictions are more realistic, less stylized than those of the Pacific Northwest coastal tribes. This one comes from, or is now at the Peabody Museum in the collections there, and shows a much more realistic depiction. This is a more contemporary art piece that was done also up in the Pacific Northwest, it turns out, but by a native artist who created it under the direction of her sibling who had a sighting. And it has some interesting characteristics. Especially noteworthy, I think, is this very deep set of jaws. The distance between the nose and the opening between the lips is very wide, suggesting that disproportionality of the jaws relative to the upper part of the head. So it's been said that there is no history without legend, and likewise there is no legend without some basis in history. And so that's kind of the motivation. Is the wild man of the woods actually the encounter of populations, indigenous or otherwise, populations with a relic hominoid, as it's considered here now, gaining some traction amongst the scientific community. Now, the state of Idaho has some claim to notoriety in this regard, because some of the earliest accounts, at least from the West, come from my region. So you may be aware that Teddy Roosevelt related the story of two trappers' encounter with a wild man, a mountain devil, as it was called. And he was so impressed with the story that he included it in his narrative, The Wilderness Hunter. This took place up in the Bitterroot Range on the border between Idaho and Montana. One of the trappers presumably met his death at the hands. I would add that in this case, the antagonism was initiated by the people. They had fired at this looming figure that visited their camp a couple of times and ransacked their belongings and reportedly hit it, as suggested by its screams and cries, and it seems that the attack was in retribution for that. Also, just a stone's throw from Pocatello, just over the neighboring mountains, in the little hamlet of Chesterfield, back in 1902, there was an incident that caught the public attention and imagination. It was carried in newspapers up and down the Rocky Mountains. But some kids were out skating on the frozen irrigation ditches, and suddenly a wild man burst out of the trees, brandishing a stick, or a club as they described it, and scared the daylights out of them. They said they were attacked. It was probably more bluster than real threat, but they hustled into their wagon and hightailed it back into town. The menfolk returned armed and mounted a search, and they noticed that they found 16-inch tracks, 17 inches broad. Those are very reasonable proportions. The one interesting deviation was that these were four-toed tracks. Now, whether the fifth toe just didn't show up well in the snow or what is unclear. They mounted a search but were unable to effect a capture of this creature. Well, that kind of behavior is very characteristic. You know, you look at this chimpanzee, when they exhibit a threat display, the hair stands on end, and they often grab sticks or branches and brandish them to intimidate their rival or their underlings. Of course, those of you that are familiar with the history of this subject know that it was in 1958 that the subject really captured the attention of the public in the United States, when tracks were found at construction sites in Northern California as a road was being opened up into that region. And then it was really only when one individual, Jerry Crew, took the time to consult a local taxidermist. And he actually took a piece of cardboard at first, and with his penknife, he cut out the outline of a track and took it down, and you know, they really had no concept of what was leaving these footprints. There were various theories ranging from a lunatic escaped